Texas says it is ramping up its patrols at the Louisiana border to try to stop the spread of the COVID-19 crisis. Danny Monteverde has a look at what this means for you if you plan to head to the Lone Star State.
Cars continue to drive along I-10 as the number of COVID-19 cases continues to grow across the United States, but also growing as the number of calls to Louisiana State Police. That comes after Texas Governor Greg Abbott ordered a 14-day quarantine for anyone driving into the Lone Star State from the Pelican State. That order went into effect Monday. "We want to prevent the coronavirus from being imported to Texas," Abbott tweeted, as the number of cases in his state continues to grow in places like Houston, Dallas, and Austin, but not more rural areas.
We want to emphasize that the border is not closed.
Abbott had already ordered that anyone flying into Texas from Louisiana or the tri-state New York area must self-quarantine for 2 weeks.
Now I am updating that executive order.
The newest order adds that requirement to most people who drive in. But the Texas Department of Public Safety says there will not be checkpoints or road closures. Texas isn't alone in screening visitors from Louisiana. Florida is doing that as well, and South Carolina is screening people who show up from New Orleans. While Texas is asking people headed into that state to self-quarantine, Trooper David Levy with the Louisiana State Police says there's nothing stopping you from going there.
There is no restricted interstate travel. In fact, there are some exemptions.
Some people who won't have to self-quarantine are those traveling for medical treatments, commercial activity, military reasons, or any emergency response.
We're emphasizing that the state line at Texas and Louisiana is not closed, and they're not turning around people at the state line.
One certainty in an uncertain time. Danny Monteverde, Eyewitness News.
Now, we did ask the Texas Department of Safety how they'll enforce this work without checkpoints. They say they won't discuss specific plans, but Abbott's order to self-quarantine has now expanded to anyone who flies into Texas from places including California, Washington State, Atlanta, Chicago, Detroit, and Miami.